All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving in today with another stack of sources, and we're ready to pull out all the really key insights and really share them with you guys.
Absolutely. And, we know you're busy. You want the information. You don't want to have to wade through all the material. So that's what we do. We
Exactly.
wade through it so you don't have to.
That's right. So today we're going to be looking at a really fascinating topic, and that is the impact of Christian missionary movements on societal transformation throughout history.
Right.
And I think we often think of, missions in terms of like, evangelism or spreading the gospel. But what we're going to see today is that they were involved in much, much more than just that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in fact, in a lot of ways, were really key drivers of kind of societal transformation in various ways.
Right.
We're going beyond just religious conversion, right? I mean, that's obviously a huge part of it.
But what we're looking at is the impact on the ground. Like really practical, tangible ways that societies were changed because of the presence of these missionary movements. And we've got a lot of really interesting material to go through today.
Yeah.
Let's dive in. Let's start way back. Let's start, with the early centuries.
Okay.
The fascinating thing we see is that from like the 4th all the way through to about the 18th centuries, almost all missionaries were monks.
Oh, wow.
And, you think of monasticism. I think, for a lot of us, the picture that comes to mind is, people withdrawing from the world.
Yeah, like contemplation.
Yeah, contemplation, focusing on, prayer and spiritual disciplines.
Right, right.
And certainly in the beginning, that was a large part of the aim.
Yeah.
But as we see over time, they become, even unintentionally, they become real agents of societal change.
Wow.
And one really good example we see is, the Benedictines. So the Benedictines, in a sense, they had this revolutionary approach to work, right? Because, at the time, in the Roman world, the classical world, manual labor was kind of looked down upon. It was associated with, the lower classes and slaves.
Right.
And so the Benedictines come along and they integrate physical labor, working in the fields, with their intellectual pursuits in their monasteries. And this is quite different. For one thing, it just challenges that societal hierarchy that had devalued manual labor, but it also, in a sense, it fostered a mindset that valued the theoretical.
Right.
And that was a key ingredient for later, scientific inquiry, for example.
Right, literally getting your hands dirty and then
Exactly.
and then working with your mind.
Right. And this has a huge knock-on effect in agriculture. So our source here is quoting Hannah. She points out that in the 7th century, when a lot of people were struggling, the monks, these Benedictine monks, had the skills, the capital, the organization, and I think importantly, the kind of faith in the future to undertake these huge land reclamation projects. So they were taking land that was unproductive and turning it into fertile farmland.
Wow.
So,
That's not just religion. That's like...
Right. It's way beyond just, spiritual, growth or whatever. This is making a real difference to the material well-being of people.
Wow, that's really cool.
And then you've got, coming along later, the Cistercians in the 12th century.
Okay.
And they also, they build on this Benedictine emphasis on work, but they take it in a more deliberate, large-scale way. So they go to new areas, often sort of deserted areas, undeveloped areas, and they cultivate them.
Right.
They come up with, these methods of agricultural administration, and they actually become major wool producers. So wool, of course, a vital raw material for the growing textile industry in Europe at the time. So they're
So they're like contributing to the economy in a big way.
Right. They're really helping to drive, economic development.
Okay, and it wasn't just in Western Europe.
No, it wasn't.
The source also mentions the Nestorians.
Nestorians, yeah.
Who kind of had this amazing spread across Central Asia all the way into India and China.
Yeah, for centuries they flourished. And this is, a part of missionary history that I think in the West we often don't hear as much about.
Yeah.
But they had an incredible impact. And one of the really interesting things is they introduced a written language and learning to groups that had been previously illiterate.
Oh, wow.
So, groups like the Turks, the Uyghurs, the Mongols, the Manchus, and our source even suggests that their alphabets,
Wow.
are thought to have derived from Syriac, which was the language the Nestorians used.
That's pretty amazing to think about.
Yeah.
I mean, just the change that comes with literacy
Right.
just opens up so many possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's fundamental
Yeah.
for communication, for record keeping, for transmission of knowledge.
Yeah.
It's huge. And we see this also in, Eastern Europe. So you've got Orthodox monks. Nephilas develops a written script to translate the scriptures into a Northern European language.
Right.
The Armenians create an alphabet in the 5th century for the
Wow.
same purpose.
Wow.
And of course, Cyril and Methodius
Right.
come up with the Cyrillic script, which is still used today for many, Slavic languages. It's
Yeah.
all driven by this desire to
Wow.
to make the Bible accessible.
Right.
And so it wasn't just about the religious content, right? It was about actually empowering people
Right.
through language and literacy, which is a foundational element for, cultural
Yeah.
and intellectual flourishing.
Absolutely, yeah. And then you also have the Celtic monks kind of following in the legacy of Patrick.
Yeah, and they're, this really interesting movement that combines learning
Right.
with spiritual discipline and missionary zeal.
Right.
And so they make Ireland literate remarkably quickly.
Yeah.
And their monasteries become really key centers of learning. So, one example would be Fulda. And they play a really important role, especially during the Carolingian Renaissance, which is this period of kind of cultural and intellectual revival
Right.
in preserving Christian culture
Yeah.
at a time when things are, pretty chaotic.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what's really striking, I think, when we look at all these early monastic movements,
Right.
is that they often enter cultures that are already undergoing change.
Okay.
Right? They're not simply imposing their own vision from the outside.
Yeah.
They often kind of channel these existing developments in positive ways. Right.
And they often work to kind of mitigate
Yeah.
some of the harsher aspects of
Oh,
those
yeah.
times, And so, their ultimate vision of what a transformed community would look like might have been shaped by,
Right.
their own backgrounds and beliefs, but their
Yes.
impact, I think, on learning, on agriculture, on the development of written language, it's undeniable and it's largely positive.
Okay, so that kind of sets the stage with those early monastic orders. Now we kind of transition into the Reformation. And it's interesting because our source points out that, for about 2 centuries after the Reformation, Protestant missionary activity outside of Europe was actually quite limited.
Yeah.
Um,
That's surprising when you think about it, right?
yeah, I mean, you would think, like, with their emphasis on scripture and everything, that they would want to be spreading it. And
Right, exactly.
so, I mean, what was it about? Was it like a theological thing or just more like a focus on kind of internal? Yeah, I think initially the
take
focus is very much on, internal reform and clarification within Europe itself.
Yeah.
They're trying to really
Well-
solidify the theological foundations
Yeah.
of the Protestant movement. But by the late 16th century, you start to see these various movements emerge within Protestantism that are really seeking to apply the principles of the Reformation to the whole of life.
Right.
And it's these movements, Puritanism, Pietism, Moravianism, the Wesleyan or evangelical revivals, these become the real driving forces behind, the leader Protestant missionary movement.
Okay, so let's kind of unpack those a little bit.
Yeah.
So, Puritanism, as we know, really stressed this deep personal conversion and living an authentically Christian life.
Right.
So how did that sort of play out when it came to their missionary endeavors?
Yeah, well, the Puritans developed some of the earliest Protestant thinking on missions. And, a great example would be John Eliot in New England. And he, he doesn't just preach to Native Americans. He dedicates himself to learning their language, the Algonquin language, translates the Bible into Algonquin, forms these communities of Christian Native Americans. But crucially, his work goes beyond just the purely spiritual.
Right.
He actively advocates for their rights.
Wow.
He works against the fraudulent seizure of their lands. He pleads for leniency for prisoners. He opposes their enslavement.
Right.
He establishes schools to provide them with education. It's a very holistic approach.
That's really interesting.
And it's motivated by, both his deep faith
Yeah.
and also a very strong sense of social justice.
Right.
And that's an important theme we're going to see throughout.
Yeah. Wow.
Now, then we have Pietism arising in Germany,
Right.
partly in response response to, the devastation of the 30 Years' War, and also what some perceived as kind of an overly intellectualized, detached form of faith.
Right. So this is kind of like a more personal experience.
This is about experience. This is about, practice alongside knowledge.
Right. Right.
So Philip Jacob Spener, who's, one of the key figures, he initiates these small groups, for Bible study and mutual support,
Right.
focusing on the practical application of faith.
Okay.
And then his successor, A.H. Frank, really takes us even further.
Okay.
He believes that, genuine individual transformation should lead to societal reform.
Right.
For him, faith and action are inseparable components of a true Christian life.
Okay.
And he puts this into practice. So, he establishes schools for poor children, including girls, which is pretty progressive.
Yeah, definitely for that time.
For that era.
Right.
Orphanages and other institutions, all kind of motivated by his faith, aimed at helping those in need. And these actually serve as, inspiration for later ministries.
Yeah, okay.
Like the famous work of George Mueller, for example. And what's really fascinating is that it's out of this pietist movement that the very first Protestant missionaries to venture into Asia emerged.
Wow.
So early 18th century, Frederick V of Denmark, he's influenced by his pietist chaplain,
Right.
and he sends out Bartholomew Sigenbalg and Heinrich Plutchow to India.
Wow.
And Ziegenbalg, in particular, has this really impressive, comprehensive understanding of his mission. So he studies Hindu beliefs and languages.
Yeah.
He undertakes the massive task of translating the scriptures.
Right.
He establishes local churches. He champions the training of Indian pastors. He sets up a printing press to disseminate literature. And he founds schools.
Right, right.
So it's a very, holistic, multifaceted approach.
Yeah, that's really cool.
And then his successor, C.F. Schwartz, kind of continues this work.
Okay.
Even acts as a mediator.
Oh.
And a peacemaker between different local rulers.
Right.
So pietism is really kind of laying the groundwork for this more, outward-looking, socially engaged form of Protestantism.
And then we have the Moravians, who just sound like incredibly dedicated to missionary work.
The Moravians are really extraordinary. They come out of, both the Hussite movement and pietism.
Okay.
And they're characterized by this very, intense prayer life and a real dedication, almost monastic in their commitment to missionary service.
Yeah.
And in their early years, just a remarkably high proportion of their relatively small membership become missionaries, often venturing into very difficult, remote parts of the world. It's really quite exceptional.
And then finally, we have the Wesleyan and evangelical revivals in England, spearheaded by people like John Wesley. And their primary emphasis was really on evangelism and kind of nurturing new believers, especially among, the working class.
Right.
But Wesley famously said that Christianity is essentially a social religion.
Right.
So how did that actually play out,
in
a practical way?
Well, it had a huge impact on social reform in England.
Okay.
So, you have Robert Raikes initiating Sunday schools to provide education for poor children who are working during the week.
Okay.
You have others establishing schools specifically for minors.
Oh, wow.
And other sort of marginalized groups. You have John Howard tirelessly campaigning for prison reform.
Okay.
They also address the issue of child labor.
Right.
They promote, broader access to education.
Right.
And this leads to the formation of what's known as the Clapham sect, which was this group of influential Anglican evangelicals who really spearhead numerous social reform projects. And of course, the most famous example of this is William Wilberforce's campaign to abolish slavery in the British Empire.
Right.
And this revival also kind of spurs the creation of major missionary organizations, like the Church Missionary Society.
Right. So you can really see how by the late 18th and early 19th century, there's this kind of surge in Protestant missionary activity.
Right. Exactly.
And William Carey is kind of widely regarded as the father of Protestant missions.
Right.
So what was it about him that
Well, so in 1792, he's instrumental in founding the Baptist Missionary Society,
Yeah.
and then he himself goes to India the following year.
Okay.
And his work really serves as a catalyst
Okay.
for the establishment of similar missionary societies across Europe and the United States.
Right.
And so this really kind of ushers in what some have called the Great Century of missionary endeavors.
Right.
And so, Carey's primary goal, spiritually speaking, was to share his faith in Christ. Right.
But he doesn't see that as separate from actively engaging with the social realities around him.
And he did engage.
He did.
The source talks about his efforts to combat really horrific social evils that were prevalent in Asia at the time.
Yeah.
Like the practice of infanticide,
Right.
the burning of widows, the inhumane treatment of lepers,
Yeah.
and even the deaths that would often occur on these pilgrimages.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and he was also a real advocate for education,
Right.
agricultural improvement, even the study of botany.
Yeah, he was.
And he founded Serampore College,
Right.
which was a key institution in training local pastors and teachers, but
Yeah.
also provided
Right.
a broader education in kind of Christian literature and even European scientific knowledge.
Yeah.
So it's like he really understood that this transformation needed to happen on multiple levels.
Multiple levels. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Now, it's kind of interesting. The source goes on to talk about what it calls kind of the false recognition of 19th century missionary efforts when it comes to social transformation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what does that mean?
Well, they give the example of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions in Hawaii.
Okay.
And so their primary stated aim was
Right.
religious conversion,
Right.
establishment of churches.
Yeah.
But they also played a really significant, though often overlooked,
Okay.
role in protecting the Hawaiians from exploitation
Oh, well.
by foreign traders and sailors.
Okay.
And they actively worked to end harmful practices like infanticide.
Right.
And within a generation, they had developed a written Hawaiian language,
Oh, wow.
translated the Bible into Hawaiian, established schools throughout the islands,
Wow.
staffed largely by native Hawaiian teachers.
Wow.
By 1873, there's this huge number of books and magazines published in the Hawaiian language.
Wow.
So their initial focus was spiritual, but the resulting social impact is undeniable, even if, later historical accounts sometimes sort of downplay or misrepresent that.
Right. Right.
And this leads to a really fascinating comparison that our material brings up,
Oh, yeah.
which is the story of two villages in southern Brazil.
Okay.
So this is about the work of Willis Banks, who was kind of a relatively, lesser known Presbyterian evangelist.
Right.
But it's a really good illustration of the long-term
Right.
societal impact
Yeah.
that missionary influence could have.
Okay.
So you have an anthropologist who studied two isolated villages,
Okay.
remarkably similar in terms of, their geographical conditions, their population demographics.
Right.
One village, Volta Grande, had experienced this sustained influence of Banks'
Right.
missionary work.
Okay.
The other village, Jipavura, had remained largely untouched by such influence,
Okay.
and the differences were pretty striking.
Really? Okay. So in Volta Grande, the one with the
Yeah.
missionary influence, what did that look like?
Well, they were living in more substantial, brick and wood houses.
Oh, okay.
They utilized water filters for clean drinking water.
Oh,
Some of them even had electricity.
wow.
They had canoes and these small motor launches for transportation.
Right.
They cultivated a diverse range of vegetables beyond just their traditional crops.
Right.
They raised dairy cattle, produced milk, cheese, butter.
Oh,
They had near universal literacy with access to books,
wow.
and they had even collectively, built a school
Right.
and donated it to the state to ensure education for their children.
So like a thriving, pretty self-sufficient community.
It really was. It really was.
Okay.
Whereas Jipavora, the village without that influence,
Yeah.
it's a pretty stark contrast. So they're living in, very basic daub and wattle dwellings, very minimal furniture. Their agriculture is pretty limited.
Right.
They're not purifying their water. They lack any means of motorized transport. They use, rudimentary lighting. They're largely illiterate.
Okay.
A school had been donated at some point but had fallen into disrepair
Right, right.
and was no longer functional.
Yeah.
And leisure time was often associated with heavy drinking.
Right.
Alcoholism was a real problem in the community.
Wow.
So it's just this side-by-side comparison
Yeah, that's really telling.
that really highlights the
Yeah.
comprehensive, tangible impact that
Yeah.
missionary influence could have.
Right.
And then our source goes on to focus on a few key areas where this transformation has been particularly, significant. So we're looking at education, healthcare, and the status of women.
Okay, yeah, let's look at those. So let's start with education.
All right. So missionary educational institutions generally operated with this kind of threefold aim. So, to train leaders for the local church, to contribute to the overall improvement of society,
Right.
and then, to evangelize students who came from non-Christian backgrounds.
Right.
And, obviously the level of success varied depending on different contexts, but the impact on education is just undeniable.
Yeah.
So, our source points out that the tribal communities in Northeast India, which experienced significant, Christian conversion, now has some of the highest literacy rates in the nation.
Wow.
Similarly, in Brazil, around 1915, literacy rates were much higher among Protestant communities, many of whom, came from poorer backgrounds compared to the general population of nominal Catholics.
Right.
And in Africa.
Yeah, what about Africa? Because the source mentions a kind of a surprising observation about the role of missionaries in education there.
Yeah, so Leslie Newbegin observed that in a UN document on education in Africa published in the 1950s, there's almost no mention of the fact that missionaries had been responsible for establishing the vast majority of the very schools that the document is describing.
It's amazing.
About 90% of the schools. So it's just this huge contribution that often, I think, gets overlooked.
Yeah, and it wasn't just primary and secondary education.
No, it wasn't.
A lot of prominent universities across Asia actually have their roots in missionary initiatives.
Yeah.
Like Yonsei University, Yeho Women's University in Seoul.
Exactly.
And the Phelps-Stokes Commission report, which looked at the work of the Basel Mission of the Gold Coast.
Right.
What we know as Ghana.
Right.
Now it's specifically highlighted how their educational efforts not only provided like general learning, but trained skilled mechanics, which helped the local economy, influenced agricultural practices, and they even established teacher training institutions, which of course are key to kind of expanding educational opportunities.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's move on to healthcare. It seems that missionary involvement in healthcare also kind of evolved over time.
Yeah, initially, a lot of missionaries just had, some basic medical knowledge.
Right.
It was kind of essential for their practical outreach.
Right.
But by the mid-19th century, you start to see, fully qualified physicians being sent to the mission field.
Okay.
So Dr. John Scudder is recognized as the first medical missionary from the U.S. He served in India.
Okay.
His granddaughter, Dr. Ida Scudder, goes on to establish the Christian Medical College and Hospital in Vellore, which has just had a transformative impact on healthcare in the region.
Wow.
In China, you have Dr. Peter Parker, instrumental in introducing, modern eye surgery.
Right.
And then his successor, Dr. John Kerr, made significant contributions to, medical literature in Chinese.
Right.
And even established the first, institution for the mentally ill in China.
Wow.
Presbyterian missions in Thailand founded numerous hospitals and dispensaries.
Wow, that's great.
So, they were really meeting a huge need there.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about meeting like the general healthcare needs.
No, I wasn't.
They also focused on some of the most neglected and marginalized segments of society.
Yeah, absolutely. So, they often take the lead in addressing things like, tuberculosis treatment in India, providing care for lepers in various parts of Asia, establishing orphanages for abandoned children.
Right.
And in some cases, they actually challenge, prevailing political and social injustices that are contributing to poor health and suffering.
Yeah. So, the example of the Presbyterian missionaries in the Belgian Congo who